It was July 4th, 1879. The mist hung low over the rolling hills of Zululand, and the British Army, now wiser and harder from months of brutal lessons, stood arrayed in a square formation around their camp at Ulundi. They had come not just for victory, but for redemption. The memory of Isandlwana still haunted every redcoat on the field, the mangled bodies, the vanishing of entire companies, and the terrifying silence that followed when the drums stopped. The Zulus had humiliated the might of an empire, and now the empire had come to settle the score. Across the plains, the Zulu army gathered, 1,000-strong, barefoot warriors moving with eerie discipline. To the British, they looked like a dark tide crawling toward them, their ox-hide shields flashing in the morning sun. To the Zulus, this was not mere battle. It was the defense of their kingdom, their king, and their way of life. The horns of the buffalo were ready to close once more. What the British called savagery was in truth a masterpiece of strategy, perfected long before any European had seen these hills. Shaka's reformation decades earlier had turned tribal skirmishes into a machine of war. He had trained men to move silently across vast distances, to fight in coordinated waves, and to strike with a precision that no musket volley could easily stop. Every regiment, known as an ibutho, was organized by age, bound by loyalty, and disciplined by an unbreakable sense of duty. When they charged, it was not chaos. It was choreography. As dawn broke at Ulundi, the sound of Zulu war songs rolled over the grasslands. To the British, it was a haunting echo of what they had faced months earlier at Isandlwana. There, over 1,300 men had been slaughtered almost to the last. The Zulus had charged through rifle fire and cannon smoke with nothing but shields, spears, and unyielding will. Their secret weapon had not been any single object or tool. It was their unity, their timing, and the raw courage that turned men into a storm. But this time, the British had learned. Chelmsford, the commander whose arrogance had led to disaster at Isandlwana, now marched with caution. His men carried Gatling guns, mechanical engines of death capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, and artillery carefully placed at each corner of the square. The infantry was drilled to rotate volleys, ensuring no line ever stopped firing. To the outside observer, it looked impregnable, but the soldiers inside that square were not calm. They remembered. They knew how fast the Zulus could move. From the ridges around Ulundi, the Zulu impis began to appear, waves of black plumes and white shields, cresting like a living tide. At least 20,000 warriors had gathered under King Cetshwayo's command. The chest moved first, advancing in tight formation toward the British square. The ground trembled under their feet, the air filled with their chants. To the men watching from behind the lines, it looked unstoppable. "Steady!" the officers barked. "Wait for the order!" And then the first line of rifles cracked. The Zulus kept coming. Volley after volley tore into their ranks, yet they surged forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed. The Gatling guns opened up, spitting streams of fire and lead that cut through the mass like scythes. But the Zulus did not break. They began to spread out, circling, feeling for the flanks. The horns of the buffalo were unfolding. Chelmsford saw it immediately, the same pattern that had swallowed his men at Isandlwana. He ordered his cavalry to hold. But inside the square, tension rippled. The soldiers fired as fast as they could reload, the air thick with smoke and the metallic taste of gunpowder. Drummers beat out commands to keep the lines steady. Around them, the plain was alive with movement, thousands of Zulus maneuvering with a speed no European army could match. And then came the moment of dread. The Zulu left horn began to curl around the British rear, while the right horn swept wide across the plain, aiming to close the trap. If the square faltered, even for a minute, history could repeat itself. Every man inside knew what was at stake. But this time, the British firepower was relentless. Gatling barrels spun faster, their rattling roar merging with the crash of volley fire. The ground turned to mud beneath the falling bodies. The Zulus pressed to within 50 meters, some even closer, but the lines held. The British officers walked the perimeter with drawn swords, shouting through the smoke, keeping their men from panic. Still, the Zulus fought on. They moved with incredible coordination, even under fire. Some used the bodies of fallen comrades as shields, advancing a few feet more, hurling spears through the smoke. One British officer would later write that it felt as if the earth itself was attacking. No matter how many fell, more appeared from the haze, chanting in rhythm with the beat of their hearts. The battle raged for nearly half an hour before the tide began to slow. The Zulu charge, once unstoppable, began to thin under the unending storm of lead. Chelmsford watched through his field glass as the horns faltered. He raised his hand. The bugles sounded. The cavalry, held in reserve, now surged forward, hundreds of horsemen pouring out from the corners of the square, cutting down the retreating Zulus. What had begun as an assault ended as a slaughter. Thousands of warriors lay across the field, their black shields torn and trampled, their chants replaced by the roar of British victory. The sun rose higher over Ulundi, glinting on the rifles, the swords, and the still spinning barrels of the Gatlings. The war was effectively over. Zululand would be annexed, its king captured, its armies broken. Yet even as the British celebrated, many officers knew what they had truly witnessed. This was not a triumph of civilization over savagery. It was the death of an age-old art of war. The Zulus had fought with a courage and discipline that rivaled any European army. They had faced industrial firepower with little more than shields and spears, and they had done so without fear. Their formation, their weapon, their will. It had destroyed a British army once, and nearly done it again. Long after the smoke cleared, survivors from both sides would speak of that day. The British of the noise, the heat, the terrifying rush. The Zulus of the square that breathed fire, and among them spread the legend that the secret weapon that destroyed the British army at Isandlwana had returned one last time at Ulundi. Not a machine, but a way of fighting, born from the heart of a nation that refused to bow until its last breath. When the dust settled over Ulundi, the field lay silent except for the low hum of flies and the distant cry of vultures. The square formation that had withstood the Zulu storm still stood intact, its ranks scorched by powder smoke, its men exhausted, staring out across a plain that moments before had been alive with movement. Around them, the remains of a nation's pride lay scattered. Spears broken, shields splintered, and the bodies of warriors who had refused to run. The sun, now high above, baked the red earth and the fallen alike. Chelmsford rode through the field slowly, his uniform streaked with dust and sweat, his face pale beneath his helmet. He had won the victory he needed, the victory London demanded, but the cost was not measured in British lives alone. It was the death of an enemy who had fought with a discipline that Europe could never quite understand. As he looked at the rows of bodies, he must have known this was more than a military triumph. It was the end of a civilization that had lived and died by the spear. Behind him, British soldiers began collecting weapons and stripping the fallen of anything useful. The sound of the Gatlings had ceased, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of boots and the low murmur of voices. In the camp, surgeons worked on the wounded, while officers sent out dispatch riders with a single phrase repeated again and again, "Victory at Ulundi." But in the Zulu kraals miles away, mothers waited for sons who would never return. The kingdom of Shaka, which had once terrified half of southern Africa, had fallen silent. King Cetshwayo fled into the hills, pursued by colonial patrols. He was captured weeks later and brought before British officials, dignified, calm, and unbroken even in defeat. When asked why he had resisted, he replied simply, "You have taken my country, but not my spirit." The British exiled him to Cape Town, later allowing him to visit London as a curiosity, a king without a kingdom. Yet even there, among marble buildings and gaslit streets, Cetshwayo held his head high. Those who met him described him as regal, intelligent, and mournful, a man who carried the weight of an empire's death quietly on his shoulders. Back in Zululand, the aftermath of Ulundi was devastating. Villages were burned, cattle seized, the once proud military regiments were disarmed and disbanded. The land was carved into 13 territories, ruled by puppet chiefs loyal to British authority. The unity that Shaka had forged through discipline and war dissolved into fragments. Within months, famine and internal conflict followed. The Zulu nation, undefeated for generations, had been broken not through lack of courage or skill, but because it had met a weapon it could not overcome, a modern industrial firepower. Yet even as the empire celebrated, not everyone saw Ulundi as a triumph. Reports from officers and correspondents spoke of admiration and unease. One British captain wrote, "These men came on as though death held no power over them." If courage could win wars, the Zulus would rule the world. Another noted that even in retreat, they moved with discipline, covering their wounded, refusing to abandon their dead. To many, it seemed less like a victory and more like a tragedy, the extinguishing of something ancient and noble. For the Zulus, Ulundi was not just defeat, it was transformation. The weapon that had once destroyed a British army at Isandlwana had now met its limit. The Iklwa, the short stabbing spear, had been the symbol of an entire worldview, personal, direct, and intimate. A Zulu warrior did not kill from afar. He closed the distance, looked his enemy in the eye, and struck. But the battlefield had changed. Distance now ruled. The Gatling gun, with its spinning barrels and endless roar, had erased the human face of war. Where once battles were decided by will and muscle, now they were decided by mechanics. Historians would later call Ulundi the last major battle fought between a traditional African army and a modern European one. It marked a turning point in colonial warfare, where the age of courage gave way to the age of industry. The lesson was brutal, but clear. Bravery alone could not stand against bullets that never stopped. And yet the Zulus had done something extraordinary. They had forced the British Empire, the most powerful military force on earth, to adapt, to learn, to fear. Even in defeat, their legacy endured. The horns of the buffalo formation, the speed of their movements, the discipline of their ranks, these became subjects of study in European military academies. Officers who had fought in Zululand would later use those lessons in campaigns across Africa and India, applying the same principles of encirclement and coordination the Zulus had mastered generations earlier. In a grim irony, the very tactics that had nearly destroyed the British at Isandlwana would influence their future wars, but the deeper legacy was spiritual. The Zulu army, though defeated, had proven that resistance was possible. In an era when empires swallowed nations whole, they had shown that courage and unity could still shake an empire's confidence. The story of Ulundi and Isandlwana spread far beyond Africa. In India, in Ireland, in the Caribbean, whispers circulated about the warriors who had stood their ground against the redcoats. It became a quiet inspiration for those who dreamed of freedom. When travelers visit Ulundi today, the land seems peaceful. The grass grows tall where the battlefield once burned. Children play where the Zulu impis made their final charge. Yet if you stand still long enough, you can almost hear it, the distant rhythm of feet pounding the earth, the clash of steel, the chant that rose from thousands of throats as the horns closed in. It is a memory that refuses to die. The British built their empire on technology and organization. The Zulus built theirs on discipline and will. One prevailed, but both left marks that still echo through history. The Battle of Ulundi was not just the fall of a kingdom, it was the collision of two worlds. One ancient, bound by honor and ritual, the other modern, driven by machinery and empire. Neither fully understood the other, and when they met, the result was cataclysmic. What makes the Zulu secret weapon remarkable isn't that it destroyed a British army. It's that it redefined what warfare could be in the hands of those who had no machines, no artillery, no walls, only unity and courage. It was proof that strategy and spirit could rival technology, if only for a moment. And though the Empire won the war, history remembers the warriors who fought it. The horns of the buffalo, the rhythm of the drums, the glint of spears beneath the rising sun. These were not relics of savagery. They were the heartbeat of a people, the living weapon that shook the foundations of empire. And on that July morning at Ulundi, even as the guns fell silent, that heartbeat did not stop. It only faded into legend. For the British Empire, Ulundi was both an ending and a warning. On paper, it marked the end of the Anglo-Zulu War and the final pacification of Zululand. But beneath the official reports and polished speeches, unease simmered. The empire had won through sheer firepower, yet the cost in pride and myth had been immense. The story of Isandlwana still hung over every officer's head like a shadow that refused to fade. Even at Ulundi, where Gatlings had cut down wave after wave of Zulu warriors, there had been moments, fleeting but unforgettable, when the line between victory and catastrophe blurred once again. In London, Parliament celebrated the glorious conclusion of the campaign. Newspapers praised the courage of British arms and described the destruction of the Zulu army as inevitable, a triumph of civilization over barbarism. But letters from the front told a different story. Soldiers wrote of the fear they had felt when the ground began to tremble with the rhythm of thousands of feet, when the air filled with war cries that seemed to come from every direction at once. They spoke of faces, painted, defiant, unbroken, charging through clouds of smoke until the last possible moment. Many admitted privately that they had not seen courage like it even in Europe. Historians would later write that Ulundi symbolized the shift from traditional warfare to industrial annihilation. For centuries, wars had been contests of endurance, maneuver, and willpower. At Ulundi, all that changed. Here, for one of the last times, warriors armed with Bronze Age weapons faced the full force of modern technology and stood their ground until there were almost none left to stand. It was the same transition that had echoed at Vienna when lances gave way to muskets, when courage alone could no longer overcome powder and steel. But if the Empire thought this victory had erased the stain of Isandlwana, they were mistaken. The Zulu victory months earlier had broken something deep within the British psyche. It had shown that an indigenous army, disciplined and united, could destroy an imperial column armed with the best weapons of its age. The illusion of British invincibility, the myth that had followed the redcoats across continents, was gone. The empire would go on conquering, yes, but it would never forget that there had been a day when the spears of Zululand tore through its pride. The Zulus, for their part, left behind a legacy that endured far beyond the battlefield. Their discipline, their organization, and their strategic brilliance became the subject of study in military academies worldwide. Officers from Prussia to Paris examined the buffalo horns formation, recognizing in it the same principles that governed the most effective maneuvers of modern war: envelopment, coordinated advance, and psychological dominance. What the Zulus had achieved with raw instinct and iron will, later armies would formalize into doctrine. Yet the real secret weapon of the Zulu army was never their formation, nor their spear. It was their unity. Every warrior fought not for plunder, not for pay, but for the land beneath his feet, the cattle in his kraal, and the honor of his ancestors. In the Zulu language, there is a saying, "Umuntu nangumuntu ngabantu." A person is a person through other people. That spirit infused their army. Each man was part of something greater, and that belief made them fearless. When you study the accounts of Ulundi closely, you can still hear echoes of that spirit. British officers described how even mortally wounded warriors tried to rise again, how they dragged themselves forward, spears clutched tight until their final breath. One lieutenant wrote that he had seen a Zulu boy no older than 16 crawl toward the lines after being shot twice, still trying to strike a blow before collapsing. It was not madness, it was devotion to king, to country, to the unbreakable rhythm of the nation. After Ulundi, Zululand was carved up into British-controlled territories. Tribal divisions were manipulated, chiefs were appointed or removed at will, and the great regimental system that had once made the kingdom so formidable was dismantled. But though the regiments were gone, the memory of their discipline and valor remained. Even colonial officers stationed in Zululand found themselves in quiet awe of the people they governed. The Zulu reputation for strength, order, and fearlessness became legend across Africa. In the decades that followed, many veterans of Ulundi would look back on that morning with conflicting emotions. They had fought bravely, but against an enemy who had shown them what true courage looked like. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that empire was not a measure of superiority. It was a contest of circumstance. The Zulus had lost not because they lacked the will to fight, but because they faced a machine that could no longer be beaten by men alone. The legacy of Ulundi extended beyond military history. It entered the realm of myth and culture, shaping how the world saw both the Zulus and the empire that defeated them. In Britain, the war was romanticized, painted in oils and immortalized in poetry. Yet beneath the surface, guilt and admiration intertwined. In Zululand, songs were sung for generations about the bravery of those who fell, their names passed down like sacred relics. Every family had a story of a father, brother, or son who had stood in the dust at Ulundi, facing rifles with nothing but faith and steel. Years later, when Cetshwayo returned briefly from exile, he was met not with hatred, but with reverence. His people gathered to see him, singing the old war songs, the same ones that had echoed across the plains that July morning. He was no longer a king in power, but he remained the symbol of a nation that refused to die. In his eyes, witnesses said, there burned both sorrow and pride. The sorrow of defeat and the pride of knowing his warriors had stood against the impossible and left their mark upon history. The British Empire would continue to expand across Africa, but the lesson of Ulundi lingered. Military planners began to understand that technological superiority alone could not guarantee victory. Courage, terrain, morale, these still mattered. They began to develop new doctrines for fighting native armies, borrowing from the very tactics they had once feared. Columns became more compact. Scouts were deployed in wider circles. Encirclement, the very principle of the buffalo horns, became a standard maneuver in modern warfare. Even in the 20th century, generals studying maneuver warfare cited the brilliance of the Zulu system. The idea that an enemy could be overwhelmed not by brute force, but by rhythm, timing, and coordinated motion would find echoes in strategies from Africa to Europe. What had once been dismissed as primitive became recognized as one of the most sophisticated military philosophies ever developed without written theory. And so, the Zulus' secret weapon lived on. Not in steel or smoke, but in the minds of those who studied the art of war. It had destroyed a British army once, humbled an empire, and left an indelible imprint on history. The horns of the buffalo had fallen silent, but their pattern remained, whispering through time like the wings of Sobieski's hussars at Vienna. Two moments, two continents, the same truth, that courage and coordination, when perfectly aligned, can shake the foundations of empires. In the years after Ulundi, the empire moved on. Maps were redrawn, new colonies declared, and new campaigns launched. But among the soldiers and chroniclers who had witnessed the war, Zululand lingered like a scar in the memory of the British Empire. It wasn't just another conquest. It was a revelation. a reminder that bravery did not belong to the conquerors alone. The redcoats had marched with rifles and cannons, yet many of them would later admit that they had never stood against an enemy more disciplined, more fearless, or more unified in purpose than the men they faced that July morning. For the Zulu people, the decades that followed were marked by fragmentation and hardship. The great kingdom that Shaka had forged through blood and order was broken into 13 chiefdoms, deliberately divided to prevent any single leader from rising again. The regimental system, once the heartbeat of the nation, was outlawed. The proud Amabutho warriors were reduced to laborers and herders, scattered across lands they no longer ruled. Yet even stripped of their weapons, they carried within them a defiance that empire could not erase. The rhythm of the war songs, the stories of Isandlwana and Ulundi, the names of the fallen, all endured, passed down in whispers and song, a flame kept alive beneath the ashes. Meanwhile, in Britain, something subtle began to change. The official histories spoke of victory, but the art, letters, and memoirs of those who had been there told a different story. One of admiration, guilt, and unease. Painters captured the haunting image of the Zulu charge. Ranks of men advancing through smoke, shields glinting in the sunlight, defying the thunder of modern weapons. Writers spoke of the honor of the defeated, and even military men, hardened by campaigns in India and Afghanistan, referred to the Zulus with rare respect. In the officers' mess halls, they were remembered not as savages, but as soldiers. The Battle of Ulundi thus became something more than a colonial footnote. It became a mirror, reflecting the contradictions of empire itself. It showed that domination carried a moral cost, that technology could crush bodies but not spirit, and that courage could live on even in defeat. The British Empire, at the height of its power, learned in Zululand what it would one day learn again in other corners of the world. That an empire can win every battle and still lose something essential of itself. Yet the Zulus, even in defeat, achieved a kind of immortality. Their secret weapon, that fusion of discipline, unity, and ferocity, became part of their identity. Every dance, every ritual, every retelling of the old wars carried echoes of that power. The horns of the buffalo lived on, not as a tactic of war, but as a symbol of how a people could move as one. Generations later, when South Africa entered new eras of struggle, against apartheid, against division, the memory of the old warriors was invoked again and again. Songs that had once called men to battle were now sung at protests and gatherings. The same rhythm that had terrified soldiers on the plains of Ulundi now carried the pulse of resistance and resilience. The Zulu nation, though conquered, had not been destroyed. Its secret weapon had evolved. It had become spirit. Historians often compare Ulundi to the great battles that marked turning points in human history. Vienna, Waterloo, Rorke's Drift, even Thermopylae. Each of these moments captures the same paradox, the triumph of technology over courage, and yet the victory of courage in memory over time. The Zulus' defeat did not erase their greatness, it preserved it. The more overwhelming the odds, the more indestructible their legend became. And what of the British soldiers who survived that campaign? Many returned home, decorated and praised, but haunted. Some wrote years later that they dreamed of the singing, that strange rhythmic chant that rose from the grass before every charge. They remembered the sound of the assegai against the shields, the war cries rolling like thunder, the sense that they were not fighting men but an elemental force. Those who had stood inside the square at Ulundi never forgot the moment when the horns began to close, when for an instant they thought history was repeating itself and Isandlwana's ghosts had returned. One veteran, interviewed in his old age, said, "It wasn't their spears we feared. It was their silence before the storm. They stood there, ranks unbroken, and we knew they were ready to die. No man fights like that unless he believes in something greater than life itself." His words echoed the same awe that European soldiers had once felt watching the winged hussars descend from Kahlenberg Hill 2 centuries earlier. The weapons had changed. The courage had not. The aftermath of Ulundi also reshaped the way the British thought about war. Never again would commanders underestimate indigenous forces as they had in Zululand. The lessons learned there, the importance of reconnaissance, communication, and fortification, became part of British doctrine. But beneath those practical lessons lay something deeper, something unspoken: respect. The men who had faced the Zulus knew they had not fought barbarians. They had fought equals in every sense, but in weapons. And perhaps that is why, long after the empire faded, the Zulu warriors remained immortal in memory. Their story outlasted the empire that defeated them. Visitors to KwaZulu-Natal today can still stand on the plains where the smoke once rose, where thousands of voices once sang in unison, and feel the weight of history in the stillness. The hills are quiet now, covered in grass and wildflowers, but if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The rhythm of feet, the clash of shields, the cry that once shook the empire. Ulundi was not merely a battle. It was a moment when two worlds collided, one ancient, one modern. And for a heartbeat in time, the ancient world nearly prevailed. That heartbeat still echoes across centuries, reminding us that courage is not measured by victory alone, but by the willingness to stand when all odds demand surrender. Today, the legacy of the Zulu warriors endures not in conquest, but in pride. Their story is told in classrooms, in songs, in ceremonies where young men still dance the steps of the old regiments. The spears they carried may now rest in museums, but the spirit that guided them still beats in the heart of their descendants. The empire that sought to break them has long since vanished, yet the name of the Zulu still commands respect across the world. In the end, the secret weapon that destroyed the British Army was never steel or formation alone. It was belief, the kind that binds a people together, that turns fear into fire, that allows ordinary men to rise and become immortal through their deeds. The same force that once shattered the pride of an empire at Isandlwana, that shook the ground at Ulundi, still whispers through time. Unity, courage, and the will to stand unbroken before history itself. History has a way of disguising its most important lessons beneath the noise of victory. The British called Ulundi the end of the Zulu War, but history calls it something else. The last stand of an age when discipline, courage, and human will still stood face to face with machines. After Ulundi, the world would change forever. Empires would grow fat on iron and smoke, and the art of war would become less about men and more about mechanics. But in that brief instant on the plains of Zululand, before the Gatlings roared, the world witnessed one of the purest expressions of human valor ever recorded. To understand why Ulundi matters, one must see beyond the smoke and the statistics. It was not a battle between Britain and a tribe. It was a confrontation between two philosophies of existence. The British fought to expand an empire. The Zulus fought to preserve a soul. For the empire, victory meant control. For the kingdom, defeat meant extinction. And when two forces like that collide, the outcome, though written in gunpowder, leaves marks far deeper than history books can measure. In the decades that followed, historians, missionaries, and even soldiers who had once fought there struggled to describe what they had seen. They spoke of the Zulus' perfect coordination, of regiments moving like shadows through the grass, of warriors who died standing. Some tried to reduce their defeat to numbers, thousands of rifles against thousands of spears, but none could explain the moment when fear itself seemed to falter, when men without armor charged into storms of lead and did not stop. That was not strategy. That was something elemental, something eternal. In a way, Ulundi was never about winning or losing. It was about the endurance of identity. Empires can conquer, annex, and erase borders, but they cannot conquer spirit. The British left Zululand with trophies, flags, and the illusion of control. Yet a century later, when their empire lay in ruins and Africa began to rise again, the stories of the Zulu warriors still burned bright. Their courage had outlived the empire. The parallels to other turning points in history are striking. At Vienna, it was the winged hussars charging into cannon fire to save a continent. At Ulundi, it was barefoot warriors running into machine guns to defend their homeland. Two battles, two secret weapons, separated by centuries and continents, yet united by the same truth, that the strength of a people is not measured by their weapons, but by their unity and belief. Leadership, too, shaped both moments. At Vienna, John Sobieski inspired his men by riding at the front. At Ulundi, King Cetshwayo commanded from a distance, knowing the battle was unwinnable, yet still sending his warriors forth with dignity. He knew the empire's guns would cut them down, yet he also knew that to do nothing would mean death of the spirit. In that decision lay his greatness. A leader's duty is not always to win, but to stand as the last pillar when the walls collapse. Among the many accounts written after Ulundi, one stands apart. It was penned by a British officer who had collected the shields of fallen Zulus after the battle. Years later, he wrote that he could never bring himself to display them. "They are not trophies," he said. "They are reminders." Each one represents a man who faced our fire with nothing but faith. That confession, simple and honest, captures the true essence of Ulundi. It was not a victory to boast about. It was a warning whispered through time. The Zulu warriors' discipline, honed through years of training, reflected something modern armies would spend generations trying to recreate: a seamless blend of physical endurance, tactical precision, and moral conviction. They were not an undisciplined mob, as some in London had imagined, but a professional army built on centuries of evolution. Each regiment was a living organism, every man understanding his place, his timing, his role. In the chaos of battle, they moved as one body. Even when bullets tore through their ranks, the formation held until it simply ceased to exist. And though Ulundi marked the end of the Zulu kingdom's independence, it also marked the beginning of its legend. Across Africa, the Zulu name became a symbol of resistance, strength, and honor. European officers stationed across the continent would tell stories of the warriors of Ulundi, their eyes betraying both respect and fear. In time, the very image of the Zulu warrior, tall, proud, unyielding, would become one of the enduring icons of African history. When the 20th century dawned, the echoes of Ulundi could still be felt. Armies now wielded machine guns, airplanes, and tanks, yet the lessons of discipline, unity, and morale remained unchanged. In every war since, from the trenches of France to the deserts of North Africa, commanders who underestimated the human element found themselves humbled. The machine may win the battle, but it is still men who fight it. Standing today on the field of Ulundi, time seems to hold its breath. The wind moves through the grass where thousands once fell. There are no monuments, no grand arches of victory, only quiet markers and the whispers of memory. The sun burns hot on the plains, the same sun that watched two armies collide and change history forever. If you listen closely, you might still hear it. The beat of feet, the thunder of chants, the distant roll of drums calling warriors to war. But Ulundi's legacy is not confined to war alone. It reminds us that every civilization, no matter how powerful, reaches a moment when it must confront its reflection, when it must ask what it truly stands for. The British Empire, for all its might, could not erase the fact that a people armed with nothing but courage had stood against it and left their mark. And the Zulu people, though conquered, proved that the measure of greatness lies not in victory, but in the will to resist. More than a century later, historians still debate the tactics, the numbers, the guns and spears. But what endures are not the mechanics of battle. It is the humanity of those who fought. Ulundi was the meeting of two worlds, the modern and the ancient, the industrial and the instinctive. And in that meeting, both were forever changed. The Zulus' secret weapon, the one that destroyed a British army and humbled an empire, was never a thing you could hold in your hands. It was something invisible, something born of the heart. It was the belief that unity can defy even the impossible, that courage can make the smallest nation immortal, that spirit outlives empire. When the sun set on Ulundi that July day, the smoke rising over the plains marked not just the end of a war, but the passing of an age. The modern world had triumphed, but the ancient one had not gone quietly. It had charged into history singing, and in doing so, it became eternal. And so, the story of Ulundi stands alongside the great turning points of human history. A reminder that weapons may change, empires may rise and fall, but the essence of bravery remains. The drums are silent now, the spears rusted, the shields faded. Yet in every story of courage told since, in every nation that has fought for its survival, there is a trace of that same heartbeat. The British won the battle. The Zulus won immortality. Their charge across the plains of Ulundi remains one of the most powerful images in the history of warfare. A final stand against inevitability, a testament to what men can achieve when bound by faith and fire. And though centuries have passed, their secret weapon still speaks to us, that the spirit of a people, once awakened, can never truly be conquered. Before you go, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next story of history's forgotten battles and the weapons that changed the world. Drop a comment telling us what you think was the real secret weapon of the Zulu army. Courage, unity, or something deeper. And if you made it this far, you're part of the few who see beyond victory and defeat. You see the story that shaped both.